Welcome back to Behind the Curtain of Healthcare. We were joined by Vinh Duong. Fred calls him the Bill Belichick of immigration law. After just an hour, I'm inclined to agree. Vinh goes over the differences between H1, J1, and O1 visas. He also covers the different ways you can apply for a green card, application timing, and more. You can find his contact information in the description, and if you'd like to be a guest, please let us know. Vinh Duong is a corporate immigration attorney specializing in healthcare immigration. He earned his JD in 1999 from American University, Washington College of Law, and his BA in 1995 from Pennsylvania State University. He is a partner at the Nashville office of Waller Lansden and leads the firm's corporate immigration practice. Vinh provides immigration counsel and assistance to healthcare organizations, physicians, and allied healthcare professionals locally, regionally, and nationally, including assisting physicians and healthcare organizations apply for J1 waivers of the 2-year foreign residence requirement through the Conrad 30 program, the Appalachian Regional Commission, and or the Delta Regional Authority, assisting providers apply for physician national interest waiver petitions to work in medically underserved areas, assisting providers and other allied healthcare professionals attain O1 extraordinary ability visas, assisting providers and other healthcare professionals who will be working in professional occupations in the U.S. obtain H-1B visas, and assisting other medical graduates and healthcare professionals such as nurses and physical therapists obtain permanent residency in the U.S. through the Perm Labor Certification Process or Schedule A. Thanks so much for being our guest tonight, Vinh.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Hey, can I make a subtle edit to the introduction you just made, Jack?
Sure.
Because this will really cut through about the 3 paragraphs you read of Vin's bio.
Okay.
Vinh is the Bill Belichick of immigration attorneys.
So, I'm a huge Pats fan. So
need I say more? He is the absolute best. I've been in healthcare 16 years and have never met and worked with anyone any finer. So let's just get that part right out of the gate. Get that done.
Yeah. So as our viewers know, I was a candidate side recruiter for just about a minute. And I remember I had one placement that was a J1 visa. So the Bill Belichick of healthcare immigration lawyering. What does that qualification look like? What's that process look like from your end? How do you assist physicians getting through it?
So I think the best way to answer that is kind of give you some background information about the J1 program. So the majority of physicians, international medical graduates who train in the U.S. Either do it on a J1 visa or an H-1B visa. The J1 visa requires the international medical graduate to either go home after he or she finishes training for 2 years, or they can remain in the U.S. if they apply for what's called a J1 waiver. And what you're essentially waiving is the requirement of going home for 2 years. So in exchange for remaining in the U.S., you can work in a medically underserved area in exchange for not having to return back home for 2 years. So that is, in essence, what we refer to when we say J1 waiver. The process of waiving the requirement of going home for 2 years for the international medical graduates who are doing their training in the U.S.
Yeah, so that's actually the placement I had was in that situation. And I know for him, the way he was able to get the waivers, he was going to a medically underserved area, which fast-tracked quite a few things. How does that process work? How are these allocated? What determines if they're available or not?
So, the J1 program, every state has what they call a Conrad 30 program. The 30 references the number of waiver slots that a state can allocate in a particular year. There are other federal agencies that can also recommend J1 waiver applications for international medical graduates. I mean, they include the Department of Health and Human Services, the Appalachian Regional Commission, and the Delta Regional Authority. Those are the 3 federal agencies that can also support waiver applications. The various states, they will allow physicians of all kinds, of all specialties, to apply for a waiver. Because there's only a finite number of waiver slots available every year through a state Conrad 30 program, depending on where you want to apply for a J1 waiver, it can be very competitive. when we first look at when the J1 waiver program first kind of was introduced back in 1994 for the Conrad 30 programs, it wasn't actually 30. It started off as 10 and then subsequently went to 20, and now in this current iteration of 30 slots. And the way it generally works is, you start by determining whether or not the area where the physician is being recruited to is a medically underserved area or a health professional shortage area. And then from there, you work to determine whether or not the physician can be sponsored for that particular specialty within the agency that you're filing for.
So, Vin, I know that having worked with you and you being my Yoda for all these years, not every state is the same. That's based right. on how they utilize those slots. Can you provide some delineation from just some examples of how one state might handle those 30 and how another state has a different process?
Sure. So the waiver process can be very competitive in certain states. Certain other states, their 30 slots don't always get allocated. So to give you an example, Texas, Florida, California, New York, those states typically use up all of their 30 slots every year, and they use it up very quickly. New York, for example, I think this past year received approximately 60 applications for only 30 slots. And so they have to go through the selection process and determine which of the 30 applications best meets the needs of the citizens of New York. And Florida does the same thing, and so does Texas. They go through and they determine, which physician provides the most type of service that's needed in a particular community. You have, in terms of how it's allocated, states have discretion to allocate 10 slots for what are called flex waivers. So I mentioned earlier that, the threshold question when you're determining whether or not you can work in a medically underserved area is determining, or rather to sponsor a physician, is determining whether the area is underserved. Not every state, though, some states will allow you rather to apply for a J1 waiver, even if you're not located in a medically underserved community. And that's called a flex waiver. And the way flex waivers work, you have to be able to demonstrate that although the doctor is treating patients in an area that's not considered medically underserved, the patients who are coming to them are coming from surrounding communities that are underserved. And so you have to prove a certain percentage of patients coming from surrounding communities, and each state is different. Some states require a higher percentage than others, but you definitely have to provide evidence that the doctor is treating patients from surrounding communities that are medically underserved.
So are those flex slots above and beyond the 30, or does that count against the 30?
No, the flex slots are part of the 30. And so the challenge from an administrative standpoint on how to allocate those 30 slots is states have discretion to allocate up to 10 flex waivers, and they have the discretion to provide less than 10 slots per year as well. They can't give more than 10 flex waivers per year, but they can limit it to less than 10 if they want to.
So, Vin, let me ask, certain states I know will keep their slots open until filled, if filled. For some reason, certain states don't typically fill up, where others fill up early. And others, like Kentucky, I know have their own guidelines for what their time clock is. I don't know how many emulate Kentucky's model, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So most state Conrad 30 programs, similar to even for federal agencies, they work on a fiscal year cycle. So a lot of states will open up their program on October 1, and they'll accept applications on a rolling basis until September 30. Depending on how competitive a state might be, you might find that when you open up the program on October 1, a state may run out of slots within a matter of a month. Kentucky, which is the state you just referenced, they open up their program for just 30 days, from October 1 to October 31st. So you have a very small window in which to file. Now, if they're not able to allocate all 30 slots within that 30-day period, they will at some point reopen the program to allow people to apply for the remaining slots. So Some states, like Kentucky, have a finite deadline as to when you have to submit. Others will accept on a rolling basis until the waiver slots are filled. The good thing about the federal agencies, unlike the state Conrad 30 programs, there is no ceiling or limit on the number of waiver slots that they can approve in a fiscal year. So if you were eligible to file a J1 waiver through the Appalachian Regional Commission or through the Delta Regional Authority, there would be an unlimited number of waiver slots that an employer could file for.
But there are some geographical limitations to those two authorities, correct?
That's correct. So ARC covers, states within the Appalachian region, and Delta also covers states within the Delta regional area. But it's also it's county specific. So when you make a determination as to whether or not you are eligible to file with the ARC or with the Delta Regional Authority, you have to look to see whether the county falls within the jurisdiction of one of those federal agencies. ARC is peculiar in that they only accept waiver applications from doctors who are working in health professional shortage areas. So you may have, for example, a location that is considered a medically underserved area or population, but if it's not specifically a health professional shortage area, the ARC will not accept that waiver application. And until recently, I think about a year and a half ago, ARC only accepted waiver applications from physicians who were primary care doctors. Now they accept physicians of all specialties. DRA is very similar in that respect, in that they accept physicians of all specialties. And they don't have, again, a limit on the number of waivers they can approve in a year.
Well, with all the terms involved here, is there a minimum time that a physician has to commit if they require this kind of sponsorship?
Yeah. So, Jack, they have to commit to a minimum of 3 years in a medically underserved area. So they have the choice to return home for 2 years, or if they file for a waiver, they have to commit to that medically underserved community for a minimum of 3 years. A lot of the contracts we see will range between 3 to 5 years. So you can always offer more years, but you can't offer less than 3.
Is there any salary components, Vin, when it comes to somebody here on a J1? As you probably know, if somebody's a lot of systems offer, let's say, a robust salary year 1, and then they're on a productivity model year 2, 3, and therefore rolling forward. Does that same model apply for physicians here on a visa?
It can apply. The main thing to be aware of is, what we've talked about so far is the J1 waiver. The J1 waiver just waives the requirement of going home for 2 years. In order for the doctor to work for the U.S. sponsor, you have to apply for an H-1B. And the H-1B visa has its own criteria as to how you qualify for that particular visa classification. One of the things that the H-1B classification requires is that the employer offer the provider or physician, in this case, what's referred to as either the prevailing wage or the required wage, whichever is higher. And so in any physician employment agreement, you always have to make sure that whatever you're offering to the physician satisfies that H-1B rule, either the prevailing wage rate or the required wage, whichever is higher.
So then a model, let's say, for someone that's not here on an H-1B, gone through the J1 to get their H-1, that can work first year with a guaranteed salary and then be on a productivity model, completely kind of free-falling, the H-1B physician, if you will, has to have some sort of salary guarantee through the life of their contract.
That's correct. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. And that's not always true with other visa classifications that a provider could file for, like an O1 visa for extraordinary ability, for example. Mm-hmm. Unlike the H-1B, there's no wage requirement. So you theoretically could pay the physician whatever wage you want. But for immigration purposes, the H-1B has that rule of the prevailing wage or the required wage.
So, from a high level perspective, what are the steps for obtaining a J1 waiver? How long does the process normally take? I know you said as states have their own individual processes, but just very, very generally.
Generally speaking, nowadays you're probably looking at about a 5.5 month waiting period for a J1 waiver to wind its way through all the different agencies. So, we talked about the Conrad 30 program, the ARC program, and the DRA Delta Regional Authority program. Depending on how you file, all those agencies are going to have different processing times, but roughly about 5.5 months. It used to be much less. It used to be around 4 months, but processing times have increased across the board for waiver cases. And so when you're talking about, starting a J1 waiver case for a provider, generally, a general rule of thumb is you want to try to look for a provider a year before they graduate. So right now we're in 2020. If I'm a recruiter and I want to recruit a J1 physician, I'm looking for 2021 graduates, because by the time you get the contract signed, by the time they do their site visit, that filing period generally in October, when the fiscal year opens up, will allow you to submit the application for them at that point. And by the time it winds its way through 5 to 5.5 months later, they'll be able to transition after they finish residency program right into that new job. Is that helpful?
Yeah. If you could also expand on any common misperceptions might be out there. I know that there's quite a few with any kind of program this large. What do you think the most common misperceptions?
I think the main misperception of the J1 waiver program is, well, let me start by saying this. I mean, the program was set up because our government found that there was a shortage of physicians in communities, especially rural communities. Here in the South, I think you see the impact that the J1 waiver doctors have more so than anywhere else in the country, because the majority of counties within in Tennessee or Kentucky or Alabama, they are rural communities, and there are shortages of doctors there. And so the program was set up for that, with the idea, let's bring international medical graduates who are trained in the U.S. and allow them to come to the U.S., do their training, and remain here to provide really an important service to the communities that really need it. So in terms of the mission, it's a very noble mission. It's a mission that's really important, I think, for communities across the board, whether you're rural or urban. As long as there's a need, these physicians can be tapped and brought in to provide or service that need. There are surveys, and I'm sure you guys can read up on it, that show that there are physician shortages throughout the country, and that the shortage is not going to end anytime soon. We have a population that's growing older by the day. Physicians are retiring, but we're not. There are just not enough U.S. born and trained physicians who want to go to these communities who are.
Hey Ben, was that a shot at me?
No.
Specific to the population's growing older.
Right. And the population is growing older. Physicians are growing older. And that requires us to constantly, increase the supply of physicians to the industry. And what you're finding is not a lot of U.S. born physicians are wanting to practice in rural communities for whatever reasons. And so they play an important role in that. I think sometimes a misconception I think people think of is, these doctors aren't well trained, and I couldn't be further from the truth. A lot of these physicians are extremely well trained before they even come to the United States, and they get the added benefit of training in the U.S. as well. And so you're getting the best of both worlds with these doctors.
Vin, something you just said that's remarkable. When I see a CV, a physician's resume, and I'm sure you've seen this before, where they not only do their medical school training, but they've also done their specialty training in their own country, maybe practice for a few years, come over to the U.S., and then actually repeat their specialty training here so that they can live and practice here.
Right.
So to your point, some of the physicians have incredible, breadth and depth of capability, by the time they finish a program here. And I always admire and I make sure I let them know that for those that actually have the wherewithal to redo their training here in the U.S.
Yeah. Tremendous, just a tremendous effort on their part and sacrifice as well. It's amazing. I mean, and the other statistic that I think is really interesting that I always think of is, I read a report that said in like 2017 of the 130 or so thousand residents in the U.S., 30% were non-U.S. born physicians. And of that 30%, half of them were here on some kind of visa. And what you find, I think, is a lot of the primary care fields like pediatrics, internal medicine, OB, a lot of the international medical graduates tend to gravitate to those primary care fields. And so when they graduate, naturally, if you're graduating a high percentage of international medical graduates, well, those international medical graduates are going to be the ones that make up the demographics of physicians that are providing services in this country.
So let's talk a little bit, if we could, Vin, about someone who comes to this country on an H-1B visa versus a J-1. There, as you and I know, and you've trained me so well over the years, their options are different. Their pathway is different. How do you assist, and what is your recommendation to the H-1s? If you could focus on that a little bit.
Sure. So the H-1B program is an interesting program because it is essentially a lottery-based system. So every year, our government sets aside 85,000 H-1B visas. And if you are a U.S. employer and you want to sponsor someone for an H-1B visa, you have to file through the lottery system. Okay. Now, there are organizations that are exempt from the lottery system. And that's advantageous because if I don't have to file through the lottery system, my chances of getting an H-1B approved for the employee that I want to sponsor increases exponentially. And the reason for that is the lottery system is just like what it sounds. Names go into a lottery and get randomly selected. And if your name is selected from the lottery, our government will allow you to file an application for that sponsored worker. And then once the application is submitted and approved, then you're able to start work. For cases that are subject to this lottery system, you, under the old way, you used to be able to file in April of every year. And if your case was selected and approved, you would be able to start working in October. Okay. Now, organizations that are exempt from this lottery system, they can apply for an H-1B whenever they want. They don't have to wait until October. So if I worked, for example, for an exempt organization, and those include universities and colleges, not-for-profit organizations that are related to a university or college, affiliated or related to, and then research organizations. For our purposes, you mostly see residents, international medical graduates who during their training are working for either teaching hospitals or not-for-profits that are related to a university. And so when they do their training for a teaching hospital, that teaching hospital is an exempt organization. So they can sponsor as many H-1B physicians as they want to, and they can bring them on board whenever they want to come work for the hospital. But when they leave that teaching hospital setting and they want to come work for a private practice or a private healthcare system, because they were never selected in the lottery originally, they now have to go through the lottery system. And so an employer, let's say a private practice who wants to sponsor a doctor who comes straight out of residency, that employer can only file in April, and then the doctor, if selected and approved, won't be able to work until October. Now, I say April, but the program has changed a little bit now, where you can actually employers now are required to register with Homeland Security and list the individuals who they want to sponsor in March. And then if you're selected in the lottery, they give you 90 days to file the H-1B. So the process itself has changed a little bit, but at the end of the day, the H-1B program is still a lottery-based system. So residents or fellows who are in H-1B status working for an exempt organization that want to come work now for a private organization are going to be subject to the lottery system. And why is that an issue? It's an issue because, one, timing is an issue. Most residents finish their program at the end of June. And so for them to finish in June and not be able to start working in October, that creates problems of having to go back home. What do I do? Can I stay in the United States? Do I have to go back home? If I do have to go back home, will I be denied a visa when I'm abroad applying for the H-1B visa stamp? So those are concerns. The other thing to be aware of is because it's a lottery system, you can invest the time and the money to sponsor a resident or a fellow for an H-1B only to be either rejected during the registration process or denied. So those are some of the concerns that any organization that wants to sponsor a physician for an H-1B to be aware of. Now, physicians who obtain a J-1 waiver approval are exempt from the H-1B lottery system, and that's a personal exemption. So they can work for any employer whenever they want once they get the J-1 waiver. They're not tied down to having to work for an exempt organization.
As long as it's an underserved community.
Correct. As long as it's an underserved community. Right.
Do you remember, when we won't get into names, of course, but to your point is, let me first ask this, and then I'll hit on the point, Ben. So we have how many slots available with H1? I think you said 85,000 now?
85,000. 20,000 for master's degree or higher, and then 65,000 for everybody else.
Okay. So you've got those slots. How many people typically apply every year on average?
I mean, for the last 10 years, it's always been in excess of 200,000 plus.
Okay. So there's a lot of physicians metaphorically left at the altar. And
Right.
You and I actually had a doctor that applied twice.
Yes.
Do you recall?
I do recall.
And unfortunately for this physician, twice wasn't selected. I mean, so it is truly, to your point, an iffy proposition. So
it is.
Ben, you have also educated me without getting too far in the weeds, but why not? We're friends on this video cast here. Jack has made me aware this is not a podcast. This is a video cast. Thank you, Jack. So that being the case, there is a workaround, as you and I have done before, Vin, with certain H1s through the national interest waiver.
Yes.
So maybe you could just address that for the audience, because there will be some that have that at their disposal. They may not know much or anything about the national interest waiver.
Sure. So the national interest waiver is one of the ways in which a physician can apply for a green card. Okay. So to apply for a green card, you have to have some sort of underlying basis to apply for a green card. The national interest waiver can serve as one of those reasons to apply for it. What it requires the physician to do is to commit to working in an underserved area for an aggregate of 5 years. So if you are a J-1 waiver doctor, or you are a physician who obtained a J-1 waiver, you have already previously committed to 3 years in an underserved area. If you want to file for a national interest waiver, you would re-up for an extra 2 years. Okay, so the time spent working to fulfill your J-1 waiver commitment will count towards the 5 years. That's the good news for the providers. A lot of physicians, as I mentioned to you, if they're doing their training in H-1B status and they're working for an exempt organization, when they transition to a private organization that is not exempt from the lottery, they have to file through the lottery system. And that carries its own risk, as we just discussed. So one way to get around that is, if you have an employer that really likes the physician and wants to bring the physician on board, they can sponsor the doctor for a national interest waiver, and in some circumstances apply for the green card for the doctor at the same time. Now, I say in some circumstances because this strategy does not work for all types of doctors. Okay, the way our immigration system is basically broken down is there are some countries where there's a very large influx of immigrants coming to the U.S. So right now, the largest influx of immigrant groups is China, Mexico, Philippines, and India. Okay, those physicians from those countries might not be able to avail themselves of the national interest waiver option because they might not be able to apply for a green card. The green card eligibility is dictated by what's called a priority date. So I'm going to get into the weeds now, okay? The priority date, think of it as a ticket number. So when you walk into a busy deli, you pull a ticket number.
Now you mentioned deli. You're talking my language, brother. You know that.
That's right. So you pull the ticket number, and the guy behind the counter will call your ticket number when you're ready to place the order, right? So the green card line is just like that. You stand in line, you are assigned what's called a priority date, and that priority date establishes your place in line. So there are going to be people in front of you and people behind you. And when the government is ready to accept your green card application, they will announce which date or which ticket number they're willing to accept at that point. So individuals from those countries I just mentioned, Mexico, Philippines, China, India, if they have a priority date that's not current, meaning their ticket number is not being called up, you cannot file a national interest waiver green card for them, because you can't file a green card if your priority date's not current, or your ticket number is not being called up. So this strategy works really well for everybody else other than those countries I just mentioned. Now, the priority dates for those countries will move. They'll advance, but they don't advance in real time. They don't advance month to month. Sometimes you'll see them retrogress. Sometimes you'll see these priority dates jump several months or several years. Okay? So anybody, for example, that was born outside of those countries could avail themselves of the NIW green card option. And what that looks like is you have to submit the 5-year contract. You also then submit a letter from the state agency or the federal agency that supports the waiver, the national interest waiver. You then submit that along with the actual green card application and a work permit application. And that work permit is the key, because that's what will allow that physician who was previously in H-1B status to be able to work independent of having to be sponsored for another H-1B. And we've used that strategy successfully for a lot of physicians who are in that situation. They've done all their training in H-1B status, and now there's no way for them to be employed in the U.S. other than through maybe an O1, or in this case, the National Interest Waiver green card option. So
I wish some of these physicians, candidly, Vin, knew this before they came.
Yeah.
I've spoken to physicians that joined a residency program, and unknowingly, the program directed them to an H1, unknowingly, not realizing the restrictions that would inevitably be there for the physician. And I wish there was counsel, honestly, for many of these folks coming here so they could maybe think about how they want to enter the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think it kind of cuts both ways, though, because you're right. There are definitely restrictions with the H-1B, as we discussed, moving from an exempt organization to one that's not. But the J-1 visa, also carries its own set of restrictions too. I've talked to some providers who, they say, boy, if I knew that I could do an H-1B, I would have avoided the J-1 waiver altogether, because I don't want to go work in this underserved community if I don't have to, but I also don't want to go home for 2 years. So, but you're right. With the H-1B, there is that restriction. And so, I mean, the system is not perfect in any way. And, maybe that was done purposefully so that those restrictions were created for that purpose of trying to get the physicians to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
So you've brought up O1s, the visas for, I believe, exceptional skill. Could you kind of get into the criteria required for that? Those sound pretty unique in this process.
Right. So the O1 visa is for extraordinary ability individuals. It's considered, to qualify for an O1, the standard is extremely high. There is a list of like 10 criteria that you have to satisfy. Really, what it boils down to, Jack, is how well known is the physician domestically and internationally. Does the physician publish a lot? Does he or she present their research or work to other individuals? Do they publish in peer-reviewed journals? Are they invited to serve as judges for awards, or are they invited to serve as judges for peer-reviewed articles? Judging the work of others. So that's essentially the standard that the government looks at when they are examining whether an individual is extraordinary or not. Now, not every person who qualifies for an O1 has to have 100 articles in a peer-reviewed journal. I remember several years ago I did this is for a non-physician case, but it was for a researcher for a big university in Atlanta, Georgia. And he was an atmospheric scientist who did a lot of research in the ozone layer. And he really only had like 2 or 3 peer-reviewed articles that he did. But the one that he did was considered kind of the watershed article or research that everybody relied on. And it was novel. And it was the first time anybody had ever come up with the research that he had done. And so based on that, we were able to get him an O1 and then subsequently a green card based on that extraordinary ability. But not everybody is in that situation. Not everybody can come up with a watershed piece of research, or not everybody is going to be awarded a Nobel Prize or something like that. So what you often have to do with a lot of individuals is pull together and build the case, as to why they're extraordinary. Some cases are easier than others. Some cases are more challenging. We've done a lot of challenging cases recently, more so because our current administration makes it challenging. But, those cases are fun to do because you get to really learn about what the individual does and how they're helping kind of either the healthcare industry or whatever industry that they're in that they do good work in.
So there's only so many extraordinary cases. There's only one Vinh Duong, i.e. Bill Belichick of immigration law.
Bill Belichick would easily get
you know what, Vin? He's got nothing on you. He could watch your interpersonal skills and he could pick up a few tips. Trust me.
Yeah.
Trust me.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall, Vin, we were working with a physician a number of years ago from Canada, actually, for one of the markets that I was covering. And one of the things he had to do, he said it was a laborious process to provide all of the criteria that was required on his part to validate his extraordinary ability. So it wasn't like just providing his resume with all of these publications. Mm-hmm. He had to go out and buy the book that he wrote and submit it to validate, that it wasn't good enough for him to just, point an arrow and say, I published. He literally had to buy the book. So it was just an example he was sharing with me of how involved it was. I remember it took a long time to get all the pieces together, and I think there are more moving parts. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Than like a J1 or an H1. There's more work to be done, I believe, for the physician to be able to engage in that process. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, it is an extremely extensive process in terms of the documentation that you have to submit. You think about it, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? If we're making the claim that you're extraordinary, we have to be able to supply enough documentation to corroborate that you're extraordinary. And if you're not able to provide me with, copies of the majority of your presentations or all of your presentation, that's problematic because, when I present your case and I say to the government, Dr. So-and-so has written, 18 peer-reviewed articles on this particular topic, and I'm not able to produce any of those articles, government's just going to say, we don't buy it. And we've seen that happen. We've for some cases where they're not able to pull that together, we prepare kind of a bibliography of their work and we present it. And we hope that because it looks so extensive, the government might give us a buy on it, but they don't, and they shouldn't. Because it's a category that's really reserved for people who are kind of at the upper echelons of their field of study. So you want to be able to bring in those types of people. And in our country, our immigration system really rewards those types of individuals. We reward 2 types: money and education. If you have money and you want to invest it in a business, we will reward you for that. If you have education, you're highly educated and trained, we will reward you for that. And so those visa categories are reserved for those types of individuals. But you're right, Fred, at the end of the day, very onerous. It's very time consuming for them to pull that information together. But sometimes when you look at the options available for a physician, that may honestly be the only option available to bring them on board, And I remember that doctor for West Virginia, if I remember correctly.
You are spot on, my friend. You have a good memory. It is long.
Well, with how much the federal government comes into play here, is there any pending legislation that might affect foreign medical graduates that they should be aware of?
Jack, I think one of the things is, our current administration keeps talking about the travel bans and things like that. And I've gotten a lot of calls. The most recent travel ban has listed Nigeria as one of the countries. And I've gotten a number of calls from physicians who were born in Nigeria, who are citizens of Nigeria, who are concerned that if they travel abroad while they're in training, that they may have a difficult time coming back. And I have seen that happen in the past with physicians who are listed on the banned countries. They've had issues either getting a visa to enter the U.S. to start their training, or even after they get a visa, they get stopped by customs when they come to the U.S. And for whatever reason are not admitted into the U.S. So those are issues to be concerned about. In terms of legislation, I think the big piece of legislation that's still under consideration is a movement afoot to ease the backlog for Indian citizens with their priority dates. Just to give you an example, we are in 2020 for Indian citizens or individuals who are born in India. Their priority dates will date back to like 2009 or 2010. So roughly a 10-year backlog for them. So you can imagine a lot of these providers who get their J1 waivers, they spend 3 years in the community. Some of them want to do different things with their career, and they're not able to because they're stuck and they can't get any other type of visa, or they can't get any kind of green card that allows them to move elsewhere and kind of enhance their career that way. But that movement would essentially remove the backlog for Indian citizens and allow people to apply for their green cards much faster. So instead of a 10-year backlog, you'd see a much less onerous backlog for Indian citizens.
So, Vin, a physician that's here on a J and goes to an H and serves 3 years in a market, are they free at that point after 3 years to virtually go work anywhere, or do they have to continue working in an underserved market?
So,
and I'm thinking specifically of those that are in one of those 4 countries that there's a real backlog due to just the number of folks that are here from those countries.
Yeah. If you have been approved for a J1 waiver and you finish your 3-year commitment there, you essentially become a free agent and you can go and work anywhere you want. Okay.
You just have to be employed and sponsored, correct?
Correct. You're right. Yeah. You have to be employed. You have to continue to be sponsored. Now, for some, the sponsorship will end fairly quickly after they finish their 3-year commitment, because during that 3-year period, their employer has probably started the green card process for them. And so when they finish that 3 years, they file their green card, and within 8 to 10 months, they get it. So they essentially spend almost 4 years in that medically underserved community. You have some physicians, let's say one's born in India, where because there's such a big retrogression for them, they know that they're not going to be able to apply for the green card for at least probably 10 years or more, unless there's some legislation that ends that backlog. So for a lot of them, they have to continue to maintain the sponsorship. They have to continue to maintain the visas that they're on. And so what I find is with a lot of the doctors, let's say from India, as an example, a lot of them will file a national interest waiver because they know that they're going to end up having to wait at least 5 years anyways to be able to file a green card. So why not just do the NIW as a way to apply for a green card? Because the advantage of the NIW versus the other way of applying for a green card is they don't need an employer to sponsor them. They can self-sponsor themselves and apply for a green card that way.
So someone that's here from one of those 4 countries that we talked about has spent 3 years in a market, decide to leave, go to your point, they're at least free agents. They've got more geographical freedom to choose where they want to work. What are the requirements of the new employer by way of sponsorship?
Right. So the new employer would have to sponsor them for an H-1B. We call it an H-1B change of employer petition.
Okay.
And you can file that typically before you join. So for example, let's say you know that you finish your 3-year commitment at the end of this year, December 2020, and you know you're not likely going to stay with that employer. So that provider, if they've identified another employer that wants to sponsor them, they can start that transfer process and set a start date, let's say of January 1, 2021 as a start date.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would file that H-1B change of employer 6 months before the start date. So they would finish out their 3-year commitment. And by the time that 3-year commitment ends, January 1 rolls around, they'll have the H-1B already approved and in place to start with the new employer.
So once that new employer sponsors, and let's say the physician's very content in that market and has another, hypothetically, 5 years before they're actually eligible for their green card, does the employer have to do anything else other than renew their contract? Is there any other cost or extension, or it's kind of a one-time as long as that physician is remaining employed in that market?
So H-1B status can only be granted for up to 6 years. That's the max. Okay? There are exceptions to that rule. And so if I am a physician who was born in India, I have to figure out a way to qualify for that exception, because if I know it takes me 10 years before I'm eligible to apply for a green card, and I can only stay in the U.S. for 6 years in H-1B status, there has to be an exception to that rule that allows me to extend enough time to be able to file the green card several more years later down the road. So the way you do that is the provider has to start the green card process. Okay. And they can do that by filing a national interest waiver. They can do that by having the employer sponsor them for what's called a labor certification. Regardless of the process they select, they have to take steps to initiate the green card. Once they get what's called an approved I-140, then they qualify for the exception. So now a physician born in India who has already used up his or her 6-year max out would be eligible for an additional 3-year extension because they have an approved I-140 immigrant petition, and there continues to remain a backlog in their category for India. That's how one qualifies for an extension beyond 6 years.
And what happens after those 3 years if the backlog is still in place?
As long as the backlog is still in place, they'll remain eligible for H-1B extensions in 3-year increments.
Okay.
Once the backlog clears, they'll only be eligible for H-1B extensions in 1-year increments.
So
the key is getting that I-140 immigrant petition approved. And then once you have that, then you are good to go as far as being able to extend. Now, that is a rule that can always be changed at any time. So you potentially could have a situation where Homeland Security, I'm not saying this will happen, where Homeland Security decides we're just going to keep with the rule of 6-year max, and we're not going to allow any more extensions beyond that. They've not proposed that. I've not heard any chatter about that, but I can see a situation where that might be contemplated.
So what I've got to ask you, this is kind of a personal question, Vin. I love this interview, by the way, this conversation, because I've already am somewhat well versed. You are an awesome communicator, as I've told this audience, and as I've known you for 10 plus years. Does this mean like I'm a geek or a nerd, that I'm actually digging this conversation?
Most definitely.
Like, there probably are some people who like already changed the channel just because they couldn't stand to hear the nuances of immigration. I find it fascinating, for real. I really do. And honestly, because you're so good at what you've done, I mean, you've jumped on calls with physicians that I've brought that don't use your service, but you've always been available as I can, as you've got time. You're a real pay it forward kind of person. And I enjoy it truthfully because I like helping people. Yep. And there's so many physicians that really, and I've done enough calls with you with physicians on the phone. Some are kind of well schooled and they'll tell you, no, I got that. And they kind of fast track it. And I've been on some calls with you where you literally are starting with the absolute ABCs. And I can tell they really don't have a disposition for the information and the process and the options and so forth. So if it means I'm a nerd and a geek, I want to officially be welcome to the club. So thank you. You're amazing.
You're welcome. You are a geek. That's good, though.
I think anyone watching this falls into that category.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Vin, for the sake of the audience at large, and your information will be presented on how to reach you as well when this airs, we kind of kept it physician-centric with purpose. I think it would be helpful because whoever is listening may as well have family members or friends that need help. So just what's the scope of industries and cases that you cover? Because I know, physicians, healthcare is clearly in your wheelhouse, but I know it's broader than that as well.
Yeah, we have a pretty diverse portfolio of clients. Our firm is pretty well known for being a healthcare firm. So the healthcare immigration practice that we have here, we handle national cases, physicians of all kinds, nurses of all kinds. We do it all. That if it's healthcare, we've done it. But outside of healthcare, we do work with clients in the banking industry, insurance industry, oil and gas industry, you name it. Immigration really touches on all types of industries. And when people ask me, well, what type of cases do you work on a lot of outside of physicians? A lot of it is tech. But you'd be surprised. There are people who apply for visas in all types of jobs. Accountants, teachers. I've done O1s, for example, for chess masters, for chefs. It runs the gamut, and it's super fun because you get to meet all types of really extraordinary immigrants that are doing great things for the country.
See, so I found out about the O1 visa for a orchestra conductor who was here on one. So that's
awesome.
Yeah.
Those are always fun to do. We really enjoy doing O1s. Yeah.
So what's the most, and maybe you've already hit it, chef. I honestly never would have thought of chef qualifying for an O1 visa. What's the most one-off? I mean, you may have already mentioned it, but kind of you're not sure you're going to see that particular, kind of case again. Anything come to mind? Or industry or specialty or expertise that was a little unique? Chess is one that I think is pretty.
I think the chess master one was probably the most interesting one I've done, and the chef too. I mean, you'd be surprised. A lot of the chefs, international chefs, want to come here and they want to work, and they need the visas to come do it. Mm-hmm. We outside of those kind of funner cases to do, we do work with companies that are trying to bring in a lot of temporary workers to provide a service that's not readily available in the U.S. I remember a time when we helped do H-2B visas for a company that brought in like 50 Boilermakers, and I had no idea what a Boilermaker is. And then we've done visas for people who need to bring in ranch hands for the summer. And you'd be surprised. There are lots of companies out there that during the summertime utilize the H-2B program to bring in a lot of temporary workers during the summer. Amusement parks, landscaping companies, ski resorts. You ever go to a hotel during the summer? The people who are cleaning your room, they're probably on an H-2B visa, So,
well, a cottage, I guess it would be, you call it a cottage market that I was reminded of actually not long ago is nursing. And there are companies, and you may be aware of this, Vin, there are companies that they specialize on bringing in nurses like on 3-year contracts, 3-year assignments within hospitals and healthcare systems, because the nursing shortage is so dramatic here in this country that that's what they do.
And so there are 2 allied health professionals where the Department of Labor has already indicated there's a shortage. That's nurses and physical therapists. And so our immigration system has carved out special exceptions for those 2 occupations. So one of the ways that you can apply for a green card is an employer, they have to conduct recruitment to test the labor market to see whether or not sponsoring, let's say a doctor, would displace a U.S. worker. Okay? That's called the labor certification process. The Department of Labor has already stated that nurses and physical therapists are exempt from that requirement because there's already a shortage of nurses and physical therapists. So the process to apply for a green card for those individuals is much more streamlined. What you'll find is that a lot of the nursing companies that provide that service, their motto is very forward-looking. And what I mean by that is a lot of the nurses that they're sponsoring are coming from countries where there's that backlog I talked to you about, Philippines especially. Mm-hmm. Why the Philippines? Because, the nurses speak English. They're trained. That training is very similar to the U.S. nursing training in the U.S. And so they're sought after for that reason. But because they were born in the Philippines, the backlog is very long for them. And so employers who are utilizing Filipino nurses to come to the U.S., they're actually having to sponsor those nurses for a green card. And once they're able to actually apply for the green card, that's when they can come in and start working. And that may be 5, 6, 7 years down the road. So a lot of these companies that do the nursing, they have a constant pipeline of nurses. They're constantly filing every single year nursing cases to fill that pipeline. So as the visa numbers advance, the nurses advance in their immigration as well. Mm-hmm. It's really an interesting process.
Well, I know probably the lion's share of our audience may be on the physician side, perhaps, but I do really want to make mention and that you are incredible on the client side as well, meaning the systems. I know you work with the system that I used to work for, and you work for big, small, medium-sized systems. So if there are any, employers that need support, clearly want them to know that you're adept and can clearly help them through the process. And one thing I have found in working with you, Vin, I think new people that are newer to it, they get gun shy, and I'm referring to the employer side. They because it seems like a dark place. They don't know all the complexities. They don't know the steps. And even though someone of your skills can walk them through it, make sure they understand what they need to do, help them in a timely way, it's not nearly as onerous as the fear factor.
Right.
They think that it is, but I just wanted to make sure that folks out there that might be looking to employ or expand their pool of workers or workforce, if you will, physician or otherwise, you're adept at helping them and walking them through it and explaining the process. One thing I will say, and I know I'm doing an awful lot of publicizing for you here, Vin, but I've known you for so many years, and it's all well hard earned, is as well, your customer service is second to nobody. It is not second to Zappos. It is not second to whoever thinks they are the swaggy swag of customer service. Vin, you ought to write a book, because one thing I know, it's deserved, Vin, because one thing I know about you is you empathize with, these people are on the clock. That this is such a major concern of the employee as well as for the employer, because they want to make sure that everything is secured in a timely manner. And I've never not known you to respond to an email or return a call in a relatively short timely period, and you resolve things, you get to the point. So I really want to personally thank you for that, because you're truly remarkable. I know the audience doesn't know you, but I sure do. So I wanted to acknowledge you for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you only knew how to coach football, I mean, you know, we could slide you in there. You know, that's the next step.
Got to teach an old dog new tricks.
Well,
go ahead, Jack.
Well, no, I think we covered. I don't want to put an early end to anything, but I just want to see if we've covered everything that we need to cover before we go off into overtime.
I like that, Jack. Yeah, like overtime. Yeah.
I threw in the free agent. Did you catch that?
Yeah,
I did. Yeah, I didn't think of it in the moment, but thank you. I didn't think of that in the moment. So, to Jack's question, Vin, anything that's just sitting out there that comes to your mind, or we kind of narrowed in on some topics that we thought were most pertinent. So anything else that you think would be,
No. I mean, I think the main thing is, the J1 program is not a permanent program. And so if for folks who are interested in bringing doctors to rural communities that need it, I urge you to reach out to your congressperson and urge them to look at ways to make the Conrad 30 program permanent. And equally important, if that's not possible, to maybe increase the ceiling on a number of waiver slots that are available. With there only being 30 slots per state, and some states getting in excess of 60 applications every year, the supply, there's a clear supply and demand issue. And so hopefully people are aware of that. And if they're not, reach out to your congresspeople, make them aware of it, because it's really important service that these providers are giving.
Excellent. Well, I think that's where we'll end the episode.